Welcome back, everyone, from lunch. I hope you enjoyed the amazing discussion and Q&A and presentation by Mari Margill on the rights of nature. Super informative. Mari's discussion was meant to be a kind of segue into this last panel of our conference here that's entitled How to Govern the Climate. And I think Mari brought up a lot of really interesting points about governance and control and management and what we mean by those categories. And that is something that we hope to pursue further in the panel that we'll be sharing with you today. My name is Simone Howe. I am a professor of anthropology here at Rice University. I'm also a founding co-director of the Science and Technology Studies program, currently a co-director with our very own Luis Campos, which is a new innovation and set of principles that we've been very involved with here at Rice. And again, I'm very pleased to be introducing this panel that I've worked with my colleague Gökçe Günel very closely to develop. So our first speaker is Holly Jean Buck. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Environment and Sustainability at University at Buffalo, where she works on climate change, global environmental governance, environmental policy, science and technology studies, public participation in emerging technologies. Her most recent monograph is entitled After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair, and Restoration, and you can find a copy of that book out in the lobby if you'd like to peruse that. Please help me in welcoming Holly Jean Buck.
It's such a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to talk about in my 15 minutes is, in a way, it's about undone science. It's about what I'm arguing is a missing field of study. And unfortunately, it's going to be about 13 minutes of setting up context and 2 minutes of invitation, what we should do about this. But the first thing I wanted to do in terms of setting context is just remind us that 80% of our primary energy use is still from fossil fuels. Wind and solar are growing quickly, but our task in the century ahead is to change this picture, right? And grow the renewables at the top and shrink the bulk of this here. So at the last UN meeting, COP28, the president got pretty slammed in the press for this quote. He said, "Please help me, show me the roadmap for a phase out of fossil fuel that will allow for sustainable socioeconomic development unless you want to take the world back into caves." And people really focused on the caves part of this, but I think the demand for the roadmap is actually very reasonable, and I'm going to explain why. Right now, we have roadmaps that deal with scaling clean energy, but rarely with discontinuation, and those are different things. So this is from the International Energy Agency's Net Zero report. The illustration here is that they've mapped out different milestones for what needs to happen at different dates. So 2025, no new sales of fossil fuel boilers. Then they have milestones for different technologies, heavy trucks, industry, what the electricity system looks like. That's kind of one way of understanding this. And you can read their net zero report. But this sort of style of mapping what's ahead isn't explicit about the social concerns that come up and the policies needed to address them. So these are some of the questions I've heard in my interviews and focus groups I do around, the costs, the impacts on people. How do you make your school run on heat pumps, for example? Is this going to constrain your freedom in some way? And if that political dynamic comes up, how does it shape other issues? So I'm not going to say there's no research on this. Clearly, social scientists are researching pieces of this, but on the scale of the transition that's implied, we have maybe 1% of the effort that we would really need to have on questions like this. I think it's clear that winding down fossil fuel systems is prescribed, And we have studies like this one about the unextractable fuels. We have the production gap report, which maps out this gap between the production that's planned and the production that would be consistent with these 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. So this is understood, but these modelers don't tell us how to do it. So it's not really, it's not a roadmap, these kind of studies. This is the United States long-term strategy. Raise your hand if you've read our long-term strategy. Raise your hand if you knew that we had a long-term strategy. Okay, a couple of people. This was in 2021. But it's not well socialized even within the US government. And it's based on emission because, net zero is a framework that focuses on emissions, not production. So we have some roadmaps. This I don't think you could call a roadmap or a strategy, really. It's more of a modeling exercise. But it does do some modeling with different kinds of pathways, with different attributes. But again, like the IEA study, it focuses on mainly kind of the technological transformations around energy efficiency or fuels, and then, thinking also about carbon removal in these last 2 red and orange pillars, maintaining the land sink, so, enabling ecosystems to take up carbon, and has about 500 million tons of technological carbon removal as well. But this is the kind of status quo of our plans. And I think one thing we need to keep in mind in talking about phase out is that we can have these national visions, but other countries do face more challenges than we do because their economies are more entwined with fossil fuel production. And so this is really a global effort in terms of roadmaps. It's not just about can the US get its act together to have a more fully fleshed out roadmap. It's how do we, support other countries in this as well. And then there's this question, which the comments of the COP president pointed to, does net zero require ending fossil fuels? Well, it really has some strategic ambiguity. That's kind of the gift, but also the main flaw of the framework. And so you can see here in the IPCC's latest assessment report, they have these illustrated mitigation pathways, IMPs. And as you can see, they put on the figure helpfully, those are different ways to achieve net zero CO2. So what you see here is, the recent emissions of about 40 billion tons of CO2, and then greater up into the 50s if you account these other greenhouse gases. What you see in these little pathways here is different scenarios for how much emissions are left over at that time of net zero and how much emissions are removed by carbon removal to balance that out. So net zero means that there's some amount of continuing emissions balanced by some amount of removals. And so on a graph, these might not look very different. They all do reflect a scaling down of fossil fuels, but some of them have more continued fossil fuels than others, and those make real-world differences on the ground. And so for this study, my colleagues and I looked at about 50 of these long-term strategies that were available at the time. There's about 70 now because countries under the Paris Agreement are invited to submit their long-term strategies. And we were just curious, what are countries projecting in terms of how many emissions they're actually going to still have at this point which they reach net zero. And it was around 18% of their current emissions. And that was from the most ambitious projections offered. So, I think we don't have much information, even though this looks like data. The quality of these long-term strategies is pretty low in my estimation. They're basically modeling exercises. They don't necessarily have buy-in from the governments or the countries. They're just like what countries were able to pull together. And I really want to thank Anonymous Reviewer 2 for pointing that out and helping me understand the context here. So you can't really take them as plans, but it's what we've got to work with in terms of how people are thinking about that mid-century target. So these levels would require quite a bit of carbon dioxide removal to compensate for them. what is carbon removal? There's a bunch of methods. This is from, again, the IPCC report, and these are the methods being researched. Some of them involve putting CO2 in, helping oceans absorb more. Some involve using ecosystems. Some involved machinery that would capture CO2 directly from the air and then inject it into rock formations deep underground. And what I want to emphasize here is that I think it's good that people are looking at a variety of things, but many of these are at a very early level of research. And so I think it's fair to say that no actor has coherent plans for how to achieve the levels of carbon removal that are currently in those long-term strategies. Right now, there's just a very tiny amount of carbon removal. That's CDR, that's the acronym for carbon dioxide removal. You could argue that the land sector is maybe removing about 2 billion tons, and then this novel or technological CDR is like barely even measurable. And I do think, and most scientists think there's going to be real biophysical and social constraints if you're talking about multiple billion tons of this. So what happened is that, in response to all of that being in the models and kind of assumed, people started to model how to achieve this temperature target with demand changes, like in this paper. But there's a lot of assumptions that go into those models as well that are going to be difficult to actualize. Like, for example, assuming that 80% of meat and eggs are replaced by cultivated meat by 2050, or some of these other changes. You could also look at, for example, the low energy demand scenario. This one is widely used in some of the modeling, which has different constraints on, living space per person, makes assumptions about other sorts of technologies like ride-sharing services, and has some equity implications too that I don't have time to talk about today. Another one is this kind of decent living standards modeling. And again, I'm really glad that people are looking into different scenarios for this. So I'm not criticizing that act. I think we need more of it. But what I would say about some of these scenarios is that in some ways we're following the lead of putting into these models different things and not fleshing out the pathways by which they could happen. So what's the pathway by which people have 15 meters squared of living space? Is that multi-generational households? What's the political configuration that enables that? So big challenges there. So what I want to say is, the model is not the map. It's not the roadmap. People are using these models to make claims about what's possible, but these exercises don't tell us about the policy and politics needed to get there. And so I think that's the missing field, is this interdisciplinary field that helps us do real roadmaps and not just kind of technocratic in some ways modeling exercises. And I will say that there are some exceptions. It's not totally bleak. Like, for example, in New York State, where I live, the gas utilities are now required to submit long-term plans for how they're going to decarbonize their business according to the state's climate law. And they're supposed to submit these plans every 3 years with this demand forecast. And it says that they have to provide multiple scenarios with at least one that involves installing no new infrastructure. So, for example, our gas utility takes fracked gas from Pennsylvania, since New York doesn't allow fracking, so that's one challenge. And then they produced a plan that hinges a lot on what's called renewable natural gas in ways that were pretty preposterous, because it would outstrip the supply that's going to exist from this renewable natural gas. And I won't get into the details of that, but the point is that they had to put on paper a plan that allowed environmental justice groups and others to go critique that plan and say, hey, this is an inadequate plan for XYZ reasons, bring it to the Public Utilities Commission and have a debate about it. And so that's one small example of an advance, but compared to where we need to be in the time frame, I think it would be fair to say that, we don't have a coherent discipline or field, not just of road mapping, but also of phase out of fossil fuels. Like we have transition studies kind of addresses this. We have, innovation, maybe discontinuation is like a subpart of innovation studies, but I think discontinuation could be a field on its own. I think we're really missing this intellectual infrastructure for this task. And if it was developed, then if the COP president says, there's no roadmap for this phase out, we could say, here's the roadmap. But I don't think we've done the work. We've been focusing on emissions. We've been focusing on scaling up clean energy to some degree. And so this is missing. I think we have some good studies that begin to spatially map out things like facility retirements. This is from Princeton's Net Zero America report. Other scientists have been working on that infrastructure side of it, but we have to go beyond this spatial top-down mapping of these milestones and really make this an interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral practice, because it involves talking with people about how their lives are going to be changed by this transition, and that has to inform any plan that's going to work. So this is my last slide. Unfortunately, I haven't addressed, how we would build this field, but I wanted to bring this invitation and question to all of you who may be engaged with this in one way or another. I think some directions are pretty clear, focusing on the ground engagement with all kinds of perspectives, focusing on workers who are impacted and also the workers that need to be trained in new sorts of industries. I think that there's an intellectual project in learning from things that have been partially ended. My latest book called Ending Fossil Fuels, which you can also buy, looks at plastics and the Montreal Protocol, tobacco as partial analogies. And I think that we need to develop concepts and research engagement methods that include the emotional dimensions as well, because you bring something like net zero to people, it's an accounting exercise. It doesn't bring in what they're feeling about this. Narrative and visualization, storytelling, huge parts of this that you don't get from these graphs. And finally, just the global dimensions of this project. So I look forward to our discussion in a bit. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker is Heather Davis. She's an assistant professor of culture and media at the New School in New York City. One of her most recent books is Plastic Matter, also available out in the lobby. In this book, she explores the transformation of geology, media, and bodies in light of the saturation that plastic has exercised across all of our lives and life spaces. Heather is also a member of the Synthetic Collective, an interdisciplinary team of scientists, humanities scholars, and artists who investigate and make visible plastic pollution. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to be here and to share a little bit of my work with you all, and especially special thanks to Semni and to Gocha for organizing the panel, and also to Adriana, who's been just phenomenal. Yes, I have been studying plastic now for about 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, but I am trained in cultural studies and media studies, and I really situate my work within the field of environmental humanities. So what I was really interested in was how to think about plastic in terms of what are the kinds of intellectual or philosophical investments that might be embedded in this material, and these are the kinds of questions that I was really interested in pursuing in the book in particular. But I also, for the purposes of this panel, felt like I needed to explain why is it that we need to think about plastic in relationship to climate change. And so plastics contribute, obviously, to climate change in all kinds of different ways. One of the fundamental ways in which I really like to think about plastics is both as the kind of solidification of fossil fuels and our kind of intimate relationship with fossil fuels in our lives. So, unlike kind of energy systems that we have a much more abstracted relationship with, one of the very few ways in which we kind of touch, feel, interact with fossil fuels on a daily basis, pretty much in everything that we touch or interact with, has some relationship to petrochemicals and to different kinds of plastics. And when I'm talking about plastics here, I'm primarily talking about fossil fuel-based plastics, which are the majority of plastics that are produced. But I'm happy to talk about bioplastics if people are curious about that afterwards. But plastics are predicted to be the biggest driver. Sorry, I didn't put up any of the kind of like informational slides that my colleagues have like so helpfully done. So I'm going to bombard you with some information, and instead you can just like look at this beautiful work by Marina Zerko, who you've already become somewhat familiar with in the conference. And one of the things that she does in this work, it's called Petroleum Manga. Unfortunately, the title got cut off. But one of the things that she does in this work that's really amazing is that she groups objects together by their chemical components. So everything is grouped together by whether or not it's PVC, for example. And you can see the range of materials that appear in that way. But plastics are predicted to be the biggest driver of oil demand as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. So this is one of the primary things that we have to really contend with. Many of the biggest plastics producers are vertically integrated oil companies, including ExxonMobil, Shell, Saudi Aramco, and Sinopec. These are the biggest plastics producers. In terms of the IEA's 2018 report, it identified the petrochemical industry as the world's largest industrial consumer of oil and gas at 14% and 8% respectively. And in addition to these kinds of these other statistics, a 2019 report from the Center for International Environmental Law estimated that the production based on the entire life cycle of plastics and incineration of plastics added more than 850 million metric tons of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere in 2019. So this volume would rise under kind of normal procedures, like all the kind of expected plastics usages to 56 gigatons by 2050, or 10 to 13% of the remaining global carbon budget, to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So clearly, plastics are a huge portion of what we really need to be focusing our energies on in relationship to thinking about climate change and the kind of question of decarbonization that Holly was so importantly and brilliantly kind of outlining for us. Petrochemicals need to be at the heart of this. It's one of the primary industries that is using so much of the fossil fuels and is really difficult to kind of move away from. So, like fossil fuels, I also argue in my work that plastics operate with what I call a kind of synthetic universality. So referring to the imprinting of plastic with a particular kind of way in which it comes to be understood as universal, placeless, and to deny its surroundings. So part of what I'm arguing, and I've argued in my work for a long time, is that plastics really proliferate so much in the world, in part because of a kind of imagination that they appear as if from nowhere and return to nowhere, right? And so really tracing how plastics actually emerge in the world and where they go is particularly important in terms of understanding our relationship to plastic. And understanding a way in which not just to move away from it, not just to rethink to really rethink our relationships to it in order to move away from it. So plastic is often transferred to peoples and places that do not consent to all of the consequences of plastics and its waste, even if and when these items are produced and used locally. And you can see this throughout the kind of history of the manufacture of plastics and the kind of imposition of plastics as it comes to be first imposed on the United States and Germany and other industrialized countries, and then as it moves out throughout the world. And what I mean by imposed is that the public was incredibly incredibly skeptical of plastics when they were first introduced. There was not a kind of, the story I think many of us have been told is that the reason why we have so many plastics in the world is because we all want them, right? We all like them, we all desire them, et cetera, et cetera. But when you actually look into the histories of how this comes to be, this is a factually untrue story. What actually happened was that people were incredibly trained to reuse materials, right? People did not want to throw away materials, especially in the wake of World War II, when plastics start to make these massive proliferations throughout the world. People, in fact, had been trained to save everything they possibly can and to mend and to reuse. And so how did we end up in this particular place? It was through a lot of very concerted efforts by the plastics industry to change consumer habits. A long story that I won't get into today, because instead what I want to highlight is the work that I have been doing with the Synthetic Collective to come to be able to try to visualize plastics differently. So one of the problems with plastics, as I was saying before, is that they seem to appear as if from nowhere and then to go away to just nowhere, right? This is clearly not true. Plastics are very much embedded in systems of what scholars called waste colonialism, which is, and this was made especially apparent in 2019, I believe, when China decided that it was no longer going to accept the waste of Western countries, and it caused a huge problem for all of the Western countries. So I also want to just say that before I move on to the work of the Synthetic Collective, that one of the other things that is happening right now that could be a potentially really interesting governance structure for plastics is the United Nations Environmental Programme Treaty, where there is an attempt to create a regulatory framework to deal with plastics production as it's produced and disposed of around the world. In particular, activists have really argued that we need to halt the use of virgin plastics altogether. We need governance of dangerous plastics such as polyvinyl chloride, and we need to ban all kinds of chemicals that are associated with plastics, including the class of chemicals known as PFAS, because of their because of their well-documented health effects would include lots of cancers, endocrine disruption, a whole host of other problems that interfere with the human, with our health. And so unfortunately, within the kind of scope of the UNEP treaties at the moment as they stand, what they are really focusing on in the last treaty negotiation that was happening was reuse, recycle, and reorient and diversify. And while all those might be very admirable goals, and I appreciate the kind of global efforts that are going into that, you'll notice that there is no reduction as a part of this plan. And so if plastic is formed in and by cultural conflict, which is part of what my work is situated in, a transformation in plastic usage will also require a collective refusal to contain our imaginations within environmentally destructive visions of synthetic technologies and the massive waste that they produce. So this is where the work of the Synthetic Collective comes in, and we work to really visualize plastic pollution in the Great Lakes region to provide a public platform to see what's happening, and methods of engagement that privilege non-hierarchical collectivity guided by a feminist ethic. So this is a bit of a move away from the kind of governance structures that happen more at the level of international treaties, and instead I would argue that that makes room for other types of action and what counts as politics, but it's also obviously a very modest, a very small scale and very modest type of intervention. So the Great Lakes are the largest group of freshwater lakes in the world by total area, and second largest by volume, containing about 21% of all of Earth's freshwater. While one might hope that such an incredible source of life will be well protected. The Great Lakes region concentrates heavy industry, including hundreds of plastic production and petrochemical plants. The region is known as an ongoing site of environmental struggle. What you see here is a petrochemical plant in Sarnia, which is also located on the Amjawang First Nation. And it continues to be well known in Canada as a location with higher rates of cancer than other areas, significantly higher rates. And in particular, the Anishinaabe communities whose lands are targeted for development. So as part of the collective, we wanted to visualize the impact of just one of these sources of pollution, and that is the pre-production plastic pellets or nurdles that are the basis of all plastic consumer goods. So nurdles will found in the waterways before they're ever used in a consumer context, directly implicating plastic industries. So this just gives you a kind of general sense, all of the known plastics producers in the Great Lakes region. It gives you a sense of how many industries there are in the region. But our study, a comprehensive investigation of industrial plastic pellets in the beaches along the Great Lakes, found the factors governing their distribution, surveyed where these plastic pellets actually end up. So this is pellets that are just, washed out from the factory floor that go into the drain and that go straight into the Great Lakes region. And not surprisingly, most of these nurdles were found near the highest concentrations of industry and population. And while we are not able to identify individual nurdles with specific manufacturers, we hope to push industry and government to adopt practices to mitigate the unregulated release of plastic pellets in the environment. And so this is, so in addition to publishing that data in a scientific article, we also wanted to communicate it to a larger audience. And so we developed an exhibition around this data and around the visualization of all kinds of plastic pollution data to try to give a sense of what this actually looks like. So this is one of the visualizations of the data that we collected about where these plastic pellets end up. You'll see here that each one of these kind of the things that are coming out from the wall it gives you a sense of the scale of the amount of plastic pellets that were found on the various beaches in and around the Great Lakes region. You can see that it's concentrated, particularly in Lake Michigan and Huron. And so the exhibition also incorporated a couple other things in addition to showing our own research. We also engaged with modern and contemporary art that critically examined the role of plastics in 20th and 21st century aesthetics. But we also decided that we wanted to have, in addition to this, we wanted to see if we could stage an exhibition, a contemporary art exhibition that both had our data in it around these pre-production plastics pellets, in addition to also asking what would it look like to have a contemporary art exhibition that has the lowest kind of fossil fuel impact as possible. So we made all kinds of different choices, aesthetic choices about this, but I think that primarily what was important for me as a theorist and somebody who cares about the relationship of art and visualization was really to notice how much our understandings of contemporary art and contemporary visuality are so much embedded in fossil fuels, and trying to decouple these things became a very large task indeed. Basically where we ended up was, if you're going to make it count. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Heather. Our next speaker is Dr. Navita Khan, a professor in the Department of Anthropology and also department chair at Johns Hopkins University. Navita's work has followed riverine societies, nature philosophy, and nature in Islamic theology, as well as global warming and everyday life, framings of the future and national as well as global climate governance from Bangladesh to Bonn. And one of her most recent books is In Quest of a Shared Planet, Negotiating Climate from the Global South. And today she'll be speaking about the concept of just transition. Welcome, Navita.
I just want to start off by thanking the organizers, Luis and Simone, and Adriana was amazing, so just a big shout out to her. When I was talking to Simone about what I was to present, she said, break it up a bit. You don't have to give a paper. You can make it conversational. This is a crowd that'll appreciate a diversity of approaches. So you'll forgive me if my talk today is quite casual in the sense that I'm going to talk a little bit about my field work, and I'm going to tell you about some new turns that my research is taking, and I'm just going to stop when my time runs out, and I'm hoping that you will ask me some probing questions which will then push the research to the next presentation I have to make of this paper in a month's time. So without much more introduction, I don't actually have a slide, as you can imagine, in line with what I just said. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my fieldwork first. I'm an anthropologist, and so that means I go do deep hanging out with people without really a clear sense of what it is I'm looking for. And so one of the sites that I have been hanging out in quite a bit for the last 7-8 years is the UN-led climate negotiations. And those are, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and was kicked off by the Rio Convention in '92. Has produced, among its very few achievements, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which ultimately has run aground because of the fact that it wasn't ratified by the United States, and then following on that by lots of other countries. It's in its second round, but it sort of limps along with very little in terms of actual emission reduction. The treaty that replaced it is in 2015, the Paris Agreement, and that was the place where I found myself studying this process. I was initially researching Bangladesh and looking at how Bangladesh is, as you've probably heard, in the eye of the storm, and what does that mean for a particular community living in the middle of a very large river system. And I followed a climate activist from the site that I was working on through the national level to Paris. And when I arrived in Paris, I was entirely confounded. 45,000 people looking very busy, but I'm not really sure what is this thing that they're all cheering about called Paris Agreement. And so the next 6 or 7 years was spent going back to try and get some idea of what was that achievement, what were people getting so excited about. And so one of the things that I discussed in the book that Simone just referred to in Quest of a Shared Planet was, how do we understand the Paris Agreement from the perspective of the global South? In some ways, from the industrialized North, it is a perfect sort of a treaty for countries that are concerned not to take any dictates from the United Nations, would rather emphasize voluntary contributions, and the Paris Agreement asks that every country submit these every 2 years. These reports that you also heard Holly mention, the long-term strategy, but in the official parlance, it's nationally determined contributions. And this is very much a bottom-up approach in the sense that every country gets to say what it is the state of emissions is in their country, and what is it that they're projecting that they will do to reduce the emissions, and then reports following on that to say what have they actually achieved or not. And, as you also heard Holly mention, in many cases, it's more or less like a modeling exercise, because for countries, small countries, or countries that, not only do not perhaps contribute so much to the emissions, but are, very large, chaotic, capitalist countries, they don't really have the wherewithal to actually go and do a proper carbon budget for all their different sectors. And so a lot of these are based on quite dubious, I would say, data. Anyway, the point is that the Paris Agreement was very meaningful for countries like the United States because in some ways it was voluntary, but it also could be something that could be sold to Congress. You know, you're not being told by the UN. It's something that we just do on our own, and so on. But for a country like Bangladesh, for instance, it puts a lot of pressure on small, least developed countries to actually develop the kinds of skills to be able to do the kinds of carbon budgets and projecting and so on. So one of the questions that vexed me throughout this process is, why do countries like Bangladesh even go? Why do they, even insist on being at tables? Why aren't they just represented by, other bigger countries in the least developed countries coalition, for instance, right? Why is it that they even talk about mitigation when really their interest should be adaptation? You can imagine that for developing countries, adaptation is a very major concern. And one of the things that my book explores is, to essentially say that mitigation becomes, for a country like Bangladesh, a way to not only speak to the industrialized countries to say, please get your acts together and get your, emissions under control, but it also becomes a way to put pressure on the larger developing countries, such as China, Brazil, India, with whom they have otherwise very complicated bilateral relations. So this becomes a very deferred way to put pressure on those developing countries to also step up their game. So anyway, that was what my book was about, and one of the arguments I make in it is that anybody who actually thinks that the Paris Agreement is really about creating plans, programs, policies about climate change really doesn't understand the international system, because really it was about getting everybody on the same accounting model. Because there's so much distrust amongst all countries, more or less. Essentially, there was so much distrust about the numbers that China produces or the US produces, etc. This NDC is really to get everybody on one particular table. This is the table that, and these are the metrics that we're looking for, and we want an accounting of how you came to those metrics, right? So that was the book, and then I've continued to go back to try and understand, how that implementation of the Paris Agreement is going on. One of the interesting things that happened while I was studying the Paris Agreement was this whole emergence of the issue of loss and damage. I don't know how many of you have heard this phrase, loss and damage. Okay, so a number of you. When I asked this question in 2015 of my colleagues and people I knew, they had never heard the phrase, and the only reference point that somebody in this country had was that it sounded like reparations, and was it reparations? But, loss and damage is quite a complicated claim by least developed countries, by developing countries, to say that we need an acknowledgement of the fact that the developed countries or industrialized countries have not done enough since they have learned about climate change in terms of their emissions reductions. And so now we have loss, which could be recuperated, or damage, which cannot be recuperated. And the US, of course, made sure that into not only the treaty, but also in the decision text that goes with the treaty, to put in a clause saying that this will never be used to be used as a liability and compensation clause. So that's been totally bracketed out of the global negotiations. And so loss and damage is entirely about knowledge sharing, insurance schemes, solidarity payments, all of these ways of acknowledging that, real damage and harm is happening. Okay, so because I was right there in the negotiations, and I saw the rise of this phrase and how it really sort of in some ways mobilized, constituencies, the civil society constituencies, but also nation states and produce very interesting kinds of alliances. I was very intrigued when this last time in Dubai to hear the same kind of excitement around the phrase just transition. Now, it's a concept that's been around for a long time. Lily was talking earlier, and she's part of a just transition. There she is. She's part of a just transition. Okay, I'll be very quick. She was part of a just transition group here. And, so it's not a phrase that we haven't heard before, but it was very surprising for me to hear it within the context of the global negotiations, because when it was first actually brought up in the Solidarity and Just Transition Silesia Declaration in 2018 in Poland, in the COP there, it was actually considered kind of a bad declaration. It was seen as the Polish government peeling off the trade unions from the civil society, social movement, and essentially having them take on just transition to only consider workers and specifically coal workers, right? And so it was seen as a very compromised declaration in which trade unionists and a nation state, Poland, came together in, and has been steadily ignored in all of the negotiations since. So it was very interesting to hear it suddenly come up and be a source of so much excitement and energy in Dubai this year. And so I've been studying a little bit about where this concept comes from and how it gains traction and what it means for various constituencies within the process and so on. So very, very quickly, I studied the trade unionists, of course, because they were the ones who first came up with the declaration. And in talking to them, it's very clear that they think just transition has to be much broader than just a workers' transition. It has to, in order to build the kind of alliances with different civil society constituencies, it has to broadly encompass women, gender, children, migrants, etc., etc. But they have a certain template, and the template comes to them from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and it's premised on something called social dialogue, in which workers and a private sector, as well as the government, sit together and come up with policies together. So this to them makes a lot of sense. You bring all the partners together and drum up something practical. But the demand climate justice movement, which is a much broader based social movement within the process and also outside, they also have taken up this issue, and it's very, very important to them. However, they think that this language of social dialogue is incredibly compromised. And they point to the fact that the COPs have now become increasingly, captured by corporations. And by captured, they don't just mean, bringing people like petroleum companies to the table. They mean that so much of the funding for even putting on this event actually has started to come from private sources, which is very problematic. And so they would like what they call international cooperation. And if you talk to, some of the bigger figures, etc., it's very clear that it's a return back to the Bandung Conference, the conversation around a new international economic order and resource redistribution. Right? And that's a whole different, it's a returning to an older imagination of what an economy, a global economy could be, but trying to, of course, do it through climate, using climate as the framework by which to have these conversations. So I think I may be out of time. I didn't get to tell you very much about Bangladesh's place in it, but one thing I just wanted to point to is that when you hear the language of just transition as it's taking shape, it is obviously very much focused on transitioning from existing energy structures and moving to renewable energy. Again, you heard Holly talk about this. But there isn't, and I love this fact that she talks about as discontinuation studies, there isn't enough talk about, what about the fact that there's a whole lot of reinvestment in what was considered old and anachronistic or of a different time. Places like Bangladesh have become, sources of coal production for, India, for Japan, and so on, right? So what about the fact that, while the bigger countries, developing countries, industrialized countries are taking up the mantle for emissions, if indeed they are, how they are offshoring their emissions productions to other countries. And then one final thing that I will say is that there's also this very weird way in which causality is being used in climate discussion. So, for example, in a country like Bangladesh, you'll often hear, climate impacted people displaced to this internally to another part of the country have now taken to shrimp cultivation, and shrimp cultivation is like the new panacea for climate displaced people. Whereas if you actually have a time frame that's wide enough, you realize that it was shrimp cultivation that created the environmental catastrophe in the first place, and that climate change has now become the way to tell a different story, as it were. So this is just to get you to think a little bit about just transition, not just in the United States context, but also to think about what it looks like in the global South and in South-South context. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So our penultimate speaker before we have a break and then continue the rest of our panel is Miles Lennon. Miles is the Dean's Assistant Professor of Environment and Society and Anthropology at Brown University. His current research centers on how rooftop solar and resiliency microgrids, as well as other climate mitigation infrastructures, simultaneously reinforce and upend entrenched structures of power across racial and class division. Miles's work more broadly considers environmental intersectionality, energy, and the co-production of race and nature, multi-species ethnography, climate and environmental justice, and science and technology studies. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. A big thank you to the conference organizers for such a dynamic, interdisciplinary couple of days, and for having me, because I'm going to offer a little bit of a non-traditional perspective, and non-traditional is a little bit of a euphemism. So I'm excited to see what reactions I provoke. I have a lot to say, so I'm just going to jump in. So we all know that humans disproportionately, and wealthier humans in particular, disproportionately accelerate climate change by, I want to make sure, is this right? Okay, yes, by burning fossil fuels that emit carbon into the atmosphere. It would therefore stand to reason that solving climate change must entail reducing carbon emissions. Pretty basic, right? But today, I want to argue that the very concept of reducing emissions is part of a reductive environmentalism rooted in a system of racialized extraction that has caused the climate crisis in the first place. Does this mean that we should abandon our efforts to reduce emissions? Absolutely not. What this means instead is that we need to think more holistically about emissions reductions, and toward that end, in the final third of my talk, I'm going to offer two frameworks for action drawn from the environmental justice movement. But let's start with the idea of emissions reductions. While the idea that we must reduce our emissions sounds super duper commonsensical, I want to suggest that it actually emerged from a deeply problematic conception of humans and nature as distinctive spheres, overlooking our relational embeddedness in ecosystems. For when we talk myopically about reducing emissions, we often render the environment as a strata of non-human life that humans can control by isolating and abating certain toxins and pollutants. And in this schema, reduction is not tantamount to other forms of attenuation that operate through different ecological philosophies that affirm our interdependent relations with the world that we comprise. For instance, when the Kashaya peoples on the West Coast reduce dangerously dry biomass and invasive species vis-a-vis controlled burns, they listen to and foster kinship ties with the forest ecosystems that they are a part of, mutually caring for the more than human world, by thoughtfully cultivating fire with respect for the life that they kindle. While one could crudely render this a stewardship in terms of biomass reduction, this term misapprehends the ways in which indigenous stewards relate to their surroundings, how they regard their environment as not a set of risks that humans must manage, but instead a dynamic terrain of life that we must respectfully work with to ensure our shared survival. In contrast, environmental stewardship focused on carbon emerges from an understanding of the environment as a repository of risks that requires human ingenuity, privileging emissions reductions over relational ecologies. Unlike invasive species and certain indigenous ontologies, carbon in this schema is not a part of a kinship tie that we can thoughtfully cultivate. Carbon is instead this invisible scourge that we know and must reduce through quantitative thresholds of reduction, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that we should abandon emissions reductions, not at all, as emissions reductions are obviously an essential response to a precariously altered climate. But I want to suggest that this reductive environmentalism is part of a broader regime of reduction that produced the climate crisis in the first place. Specifically, when we reduce the environment to a repository of risks that must in turn be reduced, we reproduce the ontological conditions through which racial capitalism produces the very emissions that we're trying to reduce. Now, this is a mouthful, I know, and hopefully you can read it even. But I'm now going to break down what this means. So, emissions are generated by the perpetual growth machine of capitalist production, but this production paradoxically operates through reduction. Specifically, capitalist production requires two types of reduction. First, the reduction of life, livelihood, and land to exchange values and other economizing metrics. And second, and this is the more intuitive form of reduction, the reduction of production inputs to maximize surplus value. How do we make a profit, right? Collectively, these two forms of reduction produce unsustainable levels of human emissions. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to unpack the first, that is the reduction of life, livelihood, and land to economizing metrics. So the production of capitalist surplus value requires that we metaphysically reduce the ecologies we are embedded in to a standard set of quantitative units, dollars for instance, impelling us to organize our lives around the accumulation of these units. It requires that we relate to plants, animals, soil, and our fellow humans as not kin, not sacred forms of existence that we collaborate with, but as discrete entities with certain utilities that can be measured through monetized exchange. In this way, capitalist production reduces life to enumerated renderings of value. While both capitalist and non-capitalist conceptions of value necessarily simplify life in all social contexts across time and space, racial capitalism is especially reductive because it works to supplant complex relationships with abstract figures that don't often pretend to represent the depths of our vital interdependencies. This reductive move, in turn, attenuates our life-sustaining ties. Seasonal rituals through which we relate to sun, soil, and elements. Social organization in which labor is complementary, not accumulative. In the process, capital organizes the relations between humans and non-humans around extraction and accumulation, calcifying the perceived difference between the two into an inflexible hierarchy, while also organizing intrahuman relations in the mold of this hierarchy, designating some humans as extractable things for other humans to produce wealth, essentially reducing black and brown people to a less than human status. Put differently, capitalist production emerged when certain Europeans imagined themselves in terms of an omnipotent category of man, rendering nature, natives, and Negroes alike as savage. That was the common word used. This ontological reduction first manifested through plantation ecologies. Plantations are a way of organizing seeds, animals, irrigation, seasons, soil, and of course enslaved humans on stolen land to maximize crop production toward anthropocentric ends. Thus, the plantation, as an ecology, bore the imprint of an ideology that simultaneously reduced enslaved Africans and non-human life to capitalist exchange values. This capitalist reductivism goes hand in hand with methodological reductionism, which refers to the scientific praxis of explaining complex systems in terms of the individual parts of these systems. Foundational to Western science, methodological reductionism enables empiricists to isolate phenomena, desituating things from their constituent ecosystems to focus on a smaller subset of relations. The first naturalists in the 18th century did this work by traveling the world in slave ships, desituating plants, animals, rocks, and fossils from colonized lands, most notably plantations. Methodological reductionism was at the heart of the scientific innovations that ushered in the fossil fuel era, as the ability to extract power from geological formations required seeing those formations as isolated phenomena, as things in and of themselves, distinct from the dynamic interplay of the geosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and of course atmosphere. Thus, our unsustainable carbon emissions are attributable to not just physical production, but also a metaphysical reduction, as those descendants of those reduced to the less than human bear the disproportionate brunt of our carbon emissions. Now, capitalist reductivism and methodological reductionism also shapes how we try to address these emissions. For when we reduce the climate crisis to a matter of emissions that must be reduced, when we reduce ecologies to carbon, we overlook how renewable energy technologies, such as solar, reproduce the environmental and racial hierarchies that caused the climate crisis in the first place. For instance, the Uyghur people, a brutally oppressed, criminalized ethnic minority in China, are forced to work without pay under a racialized penal system in factories that produce polysilicon, the central material in most solar panels. They do this under toxic environmental conditions in plants powered by, of all things, coal. Thus, solar technology is produced through a combination of extracted industries, fossil fuel, modern-day slavery, and structural racism that is directly attributable to the imperative to reduce production costs to make solar economically viable. It doesn't need to be made this way. Modern-day slavery is also instrumental in the mining of cobalt, which is a central component of the battery storage technologies through which buildings can use solar energy on cloudy days. Workers in the Democratic Republic of Congo produce over half of the world's cobalt under unregulated, hazardous, and often deadly conditions, work that is largely powered by, you guessed it, fossil fuels, for a multinational industry intent on reducing costs in the name of a green energy transition. Thus, as we try to reduce emissions, we reproduce the ontological hierarchies and environmental injustices that caused our emissions problems in the first place. This demands that we reduce emissions without reducing ecologies to carbon and without reducing economies to accumulation. And toward this end, I want to briefly highlight two conceptual frameworks championed by the environmental justice movement, or the EJ movement. The first is the framework of co-pollutants. This framework highlights how energy generation and other industrial practices simultaneously generate carbon and pollutants such as nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. In labeling such pollutants co-pollutants, EJ scholars highlight how the fossil-fueled infrastructures that significantly contribute to climate change also contribute to public health problems that disproportionately impact poor communities of color. Analyses of co-pollutants highlight the ways in which some strategies to reduce carbon only marginally reduce environmental hazards in marginalized communities, and inversely, the ways in which other strategies significantly address environmental injustices because there's not in an identical correlation between carbon emissions and co-pollutants across different sectors, meaning that some efforts to mitigate carbon emissions more effectively mitigate co-pollutants than other efforts. While this framework still focuses on reduction, it allows us to engage in reduction more equitably, enabling us to address a broad suite of environmental impacts that reduce communities of color to the less than human status. We can apply this framework in the deployment of emissions reducing technologies like solar. Just as consumption of fossil fuels generates nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, the production of solar utilizes silicon tetrachloride, hydrofluoric acid, cadmium, and other toxins that disproportionately harm poor communities of color. We can conceptualize these hazards as the co-pollutants of the admittedly minimal carbon emissions generated by solar production. And with this framework in mind, we can develop strategies to deploy solar technologies in ways that focus not just on reducing carbon, but instead in holistically mitigating the forms of environmental degradation that have historically reduced communities of color to extractive sacrifice zones. These communities can work together with funding, for instance, under the Inflation Reduction Act, to aggregate local solar demand and in turn demand that the solar installers they work with screen for co-pollutants through contracting, supply chain monitoring, and procurement. This brings me to the second framework, ecological unity, a principle that can move us even further beyond a reductive approach to emissions reduction. This principle is found in the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, the manifesto of the EJ movement, which states, quote, "We, the people of color, gathered together, do hereby reestablish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth. Environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species." BK Rott, a Brooklyn-based waste composting organization led by young people of color, offers a blueprint for centering this ecological unity aspiration in the deployment of emissions-reducing technologies. For a small fee, BK Rott's young workers of color haul food waste with solar-powered cargo trikes from businesses and homes to a community garden in a low-income neighborhood. They then use solar-powered mechanical sifters to convert this waste into compost, which they use both to generate life in the garden and to sell to agriculturists beyond the garden. Revenues from compost sales and waste hauling combined with nonprofit funding enable BK Rott to pay their youth workers a living wage for labor that is usually unpaid in other contexts. BK Rott is a paragon for repurposing emissions-reducing technologies toward the ecological unity principle in a couple ways. First, they combine physical labor and solar power to generate reciprocal relations between human bodies and more than human life. By tapping the power of the sun, their cargo trikes enhance the power of their workers' quads, glutes, hamstrings, and hips to pedal and haul organic waste throughout the city. Put simply, BK Rott combines their corporeal strength and solar electricity to collect and drop off food scraps. They further bring together what Larry Lohman calls the little e energies of the human body with the big E energy of electrical infrastructure when they lift mounds of food scraps and dump them into solar-powered mechanical sifters that help to rapidly transform waste into reusable compost. The soily product of these solar-human interactions is then used to grow and enhance vegetation both in the community garden, off of an otherwise treeless avenue, and in indoor and outdoor gardens throughout the city. Instead of trying to narrowly reduce humans' impact on the environment, as though the human and non-human worlds are separate, solar power in this context enables humans to work with and dwell in the non-human world, positioning that world as a part of an urban landscape. When the power of our limbs and the power of the sun come together, we can generate life in ways that posit human impact as regenerative, not as a scourge on the environment that must be reduced. This mutually beneficial entanglement of bodies and solar exemplifies ecological unity, reciprocity between humans and their environment. Furthermore, BK Rott recognizes that fossil fuels aren't just problematic because they produce carbon. They must, and then that's not the only reason why they must be reduced. Fossil fuels additionally deprive poor communities of color, of vegetation, robust soil ecosystems, and permeable surfaces. As such, these communities' fossil fuel precarity requires not simply new technology, but rather a new approach to stewarding the landscapes that we deprive of life and to providing for the people who actually populate those landscapes. B.K. Rott offers one such approach, with solar technology as an aid, not as a panacea. These young people live, breathe, bike, hold, touch, and haul a tangible alternative to fossil-fueled waste, making physical spaces capable of cleaning the air and safeguarding against climate disasters in ways that simply reducing their carbon footprint through new technology and new infrastructure never could. Thank you.